The library of Blackmere Hall presented itself as a temple to that particularly English form of conspicuous cultivation, wherein the possession of leather-bound volumes serves primarily as an assertion of social standing rather than any genuine inclination toward their contents. The room itself was handsome enough in a conventional manner. Tall windows overlooking the lake, mahogany shelving, a fireplace of adequate proportions. But it possessed that unmistakable quality of a space that has been carefully curated by someone with more money than discernment. The sort of room where first editions stand companionably beside reprints and nobody has quite noticed the difference. The body of Nigel Hartwell Crane lay upon the Turkish carpet before the desk, exactly where the local constabulary had left it pending the arrival of the coroner's final assessment. And Whimsy observed with clinical detachment that the corpse maintained that peculiar dignity of the recently deceased, before putrefaction begins its rather undignified work of reminding observers that all flesh is merely temporary architecture. The empty wine-glass sat upon the side table, precisely where one might have expected a gentleman to place it during an afternoon of solitary reading, and the door to the room remained locked, though Whimsy noted with interest that the key hung in the lock itself, an arrangement that suggested either remarkable confidence in the household's honesty or a mind preoccupied with matters more pressing than security.
Bunter, moving with that economical grace that characterized all his movements, had already begun the quiet work of documentation, whilst Whimsy himself stood motionless for several moments, conducting what appeared to be a meditation upon nothing in particular, but was in fact a systematic inventory of the room's every detail, from the precise angle at which a chair had been pushed back from the desk to the faint odor that lingered in the still air. Something chemical and vaguely fruity, though whether this emanated from the poisoned wine or from some other source remained, for the moment, a matter requiring clarification.
He moved then with sudden purposefulness toward the desk, where a number of documents lay in neat arrangement, and began to examine them with an intensity that suggested he was reading not merely the words, but attempting to divine the mind of the man who had arranged them in such precise order. A letter half-written lay beneath a paperweight, addressed to someone identified only as M, and containing nothing more illuminating than a complaint concerning the quality of the estate's dairy produce and a passing reference to the matter we discussed in town. Bank statements suggested a man of considerable wealth, but not, Whimsy noted with interest, quite as considerable as one might have expected given the size of the hall and the apparent resources devoted to its maintenance. There were additionally several documents relating to the sale of properties, all bearing dates within the last 6 months, and a curious ledger in which various sums had been recorded in a handwriting that was clearly not Nigel Hartwell Crane's own. It was this last discovery that occasioned the faintest smile upon Whimsy's features, though he made no comment, merely returning the ledger to its precise position and turning his attention instead to the wine-glass itself. He approached it with the manner of a man examining an artifact of archaeological significance rather than the instrument of a man's death, and without touching it, subjected it to a scrutiny so intense that one might have thought he intended to read moral lessons from its crystalline surface. The glass itself was of good quality, Waterford or possibly Baccarat, and contained a residue of wine that had evidently been of a superior vintage, though whether it had been sufficiently superior to overcome the unpleasant properties imparted by whatever poison had been introduced into it seemed rather to be a matter upon which the deceased had formed an opinion somewhat too late to express. The windows, Whimsy noted next, were all secured from within, and the curtains, though drawn across the glass in the manner of a room prepared for solitude, showed no signs of disturbance. A servant's bell hung beside the door, its pull-rope intact and offering no evidence of recent use, whilst the fireplace contained nothing more suspicious than ash of the ordinary sort, the accumulated remnants of what appeared to have been a modest fire, perhaps from the previous evening. He moved then to the bookshelves with what appeared to be casual interest, running his fingers along the spines with the absorption of a bibliophile. Though his selections were governed by nothing so innocent as aesthetic appreciation or intellectual curiosity, he was instead examining which volumes showed signs of actual use, which had been read rather than merely displayed. and in what order they had been arranged. This examination occupied him for perhaps 10 minutes, during which time Mrs. Hartwell Crane grew increasingly anxious, and the local inspector, whose name was Tremaine, and whose expression suggested a man accustomed to far simpler murders in far simpler places, began to display that particular form of impatience that characterizes officials confronted with civilians who seem determined to complicate matters through the introduction of excessive subtlety.
It was only when Tremaine ventured to inquire with barely concealed exasperation whether Lord Peter intended to actually investigate the death or merely to audit the literary tastes of the deceased that Wimsey turned from the books with an expression of elaborate innocence and suggested, with perfect courtesy, that the inspector might perhaps occupy himself with establishing the precise timeline of the deceased's movements throughout the day in question. A task that seemed to Wimsey considerably more pressing than any immediate attempt at solving the puzzle, given that one could hardly determine how a man had been poisoned without first establishing the exact moment at which the poison had been introduced into his system.
This observation, delivered with such civil precision that it took several moments for its essentially barbed nature to become apparent, had the curious effect of reminding everyone present that Lord Peter Wimsey, whatever his occasional displays of affectation and eccentricity, possessed a mind that operated upon a plane rather elevated above the ordinary, and that his presence at Blackmere Hall represented either the household's exceptional good fortune or the universe's rather cruel sense of humor, depending upon one's perspective. Inspector Tremaine, possessed of that particular brand of provincial competence that functions adequately within narrow parameters, but tends toward paralysis when confronted with anything approaching genuine complexity, gathered his notes with an expression suggesting he had been mildly rebuked by a superior officer, which was, of course, precisely the effect Wimsey had intended. The inspector withdrew to the drawing-room to conduct his interviews with the household staff, a task that he approached with the methodical precision of a man who has learned, through long experience, that most murders are committed by people standing in plain sight, and that the primary function of investigation is to establish who had motive, means, and opportunity, rather than to indulge in flights of intuitive speculation. Wimsey, meanwhile, requested of Mrs. Hartwell Crane the pleasure of an interview with her household in their respective quarters, beginning, if she had no objection, with the servants most intimately acquainted with her brother-in-law's habits and daily routine. This request was granted with the evident relief of a woman who recognized that she was being, however tactfully, removed from the immediate sphere of investigation. And within the quarter hour, Wimsey found himself in the servants' hall, that curious realm of domestic hierarchy wherein distinctions of rank and precedence are observed with a rigor that would have pleased the most fastidious Prussian general. The butler, a man of perhaps 55 years named Calthorpe, presented himself with the formal correctness of his breed, and Wimsey began not with questions concerning the death or the movements of the deceased, but instead with an inquiry of such apparent randomness that it occasioned visible bewilderment upon the faces of those assembled. He wished to know, with elaborate courtesy, the precise date upon which the library curtains had been last cleaned, whether the servant's bell in that room had been recently serviced, and whether the household had noticed any unusual wear upon the carpets or furniture in recent months. Calthorpe, who had been bracing himself for questions of substance, found himself forced to consult his memory for details of such transcendent insignificance that he was reduced to consulting with the under-butler and eventually the housekeeper, a formidable woman named Mrs. Crabtree, whose expression suggested that she viewed the entire affair as an insufferable intrusion upon her carefully maintained domestic arrangements. It was Mrs. Crabtree who eventually provided the information that the library curtains had been cleaned some 3 weeks previous, that the servant's bell required replacement of its internal spring approximately 6 months ago, and that, now that it was mentioned, she had indeed noticed certain anomalies in the arrangement of the library furniture, though she attributed these to Mr. Hartwell Crane's own restlessness, as he had apparently spent considerable time in that room during his stay, rearranging books and moving chairs with a sort of purposeless energy that often characterizes men of anxious temperament. Wimsey received this information with the air of one who has just been handed the key to an elaborate lock, though his expression betrayed nothing beyond polite interest, and he proceeded instead to inquire whether anyone had observed Mr. Hartwell Crane receiving any visitors during his stay. whether his correspondence had seemed unusual in volume or nature, and whether he had appeared particularly anxious or distressed during his final days. Here it was the younger housemaid, a girl of perhaps 20 years named Annie, who ventured to speak, her voice barely above a whisper and her manner suggesting that she was transgressing some unspoken code of household discretion. She had observed, she said, a gentleman caller who had arrived on the afternoon of the second day of Mr. Hartwell Crane's residence, a thin, sharp-faced man of middle years who had requested to see the master in the library and had remained closeted with him for approximately 2 hours. She had not heard raised voices, but she had observed through the keyhole. Here she blushed furiously and seemed about to retract her testimony. That the two men had been engaged in what appeared to be a disagreement of some intensity, characterized by much gesticulation and, at one point, what she believed to be the tearing of a document. The gentleman had departed shortly thereafter, and she had not observed him again, though she believed she had heard the front door open and close several times during the days subsequent to this visit, at hours when no ordinary caller would be expected. Whimsy listened to this account with that particular intensity that suggested he was extracting meaning from the spaces between words as much as from the words themselves, and when Annie had finished, he thanked her with a courtesy that seemed almost excessive given her station, and inquired whether anyone in the household possessed any knowledge concerning the identity of this mysterious visitor or the nature of the business that had occasioned his call. It was Calthorpe, after a moment's hesitation during which his expression suggested an internal struggle between professional loyalty and simple human curiosity, who ventured to mention that a letter had arrived the morning of Mr. Hartwell Crane's death, bearing a London postmark and addressed in handwriting that appeared to be the same as that which had characterized the disputed document mentioned by Annie. The letter had been sealed and marked private, which was of course the usual discretion, but Calthorpe believed that upon receipt of it, Mr. Hartwell Crane had blanched noticeably and had immediately secluded himself in the library, requesting that he be disturbed for nothing short of an emergency. Mrs. Crabtree added, with the precision of one accustomed to observing every detail of household management, that Mr. Hartwell Crane's luncheon had been left untouched that day, and that when she had inquired whether anything was amiss, he had dismissed her with unusual curtness and requested that a particularly fine bottle of claret be brought to the library, a request she had honored, though she noted with some asperity that the bottle had been an exceptional vintage, precisely the sort of wine that ought not to have been wasted upon a solitary afternoon's brooding. Whimsy received this final piece of information with the air of a man whose suspicions have been confirmed by evidence, though whether his expression reflected satisfaction or disappointment remained a matter of some uncertainty, and he dismissed the servants with thanks that seemed to suggest they had participated in a particularly illuminating intellectual exercise rather than a murder inquiry. Once the household had withdrawn, he sat in silence for several moments, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic pose that Bunter recognized as indicating intensive cerebral activity, and it was only when Inspector Tremaine reappeared with his own collection of interviews that Whimsy stirred himself to inquire what conclusions the inspector had drawn from his examination of the household. Tremaine, who had spent the preceding hour extracting largely irrelevant details from the servants, whilst simultaneously attempting to determine whether any of them possessed motive or opportunity for poisoning the deceased, reported with the cautious optimism of a man hoping to be commended for diligence that he had identified several areas of interest that might warrant further investigation. The butler, he noted, had been the one to deliver the wine to the library, and whilst Calthorpe had protested his inability to comprehend why he would poison a gentleman for whom he harbored no particular ill will, such protestations were, Tremaine observed with the wisdom of experience, often merely the prelude to a confession once sufficient pressure had been applied. Whimsy heard this assessment with a gravity that seemed to acknowledge the inspector's reasoning, whilst simultaneously suggesting that it represented a singularly inadequate understanding of the facts in evidence, and he ventured to inquire, with elaborate courtesy, whether Tremaine had given consideration to the possibility that the poisoning might not have occurred at all in the manner that everyone had thus far assumed. The inspector, who had begun the day with the satisfaction of a straightforward case, a locked room, a poisoned wine glass, a convenient suspect, suddenly found himself confronted with the prospect that the entire edifice of his investigation might require reconstruction. And his expression reflected something approaching dismay. Whimsy elaborated, with the gentle precision of a tutor instructing a promising but somewhat slow pupil, that the chronology of events suggested a rather different sequence than the one currently under consideration, and that the letter which had arrived on the morning of the deceased's death seemed to him of considerably greater significance than the butler's access to the wine cellar. He proposed, therefore, that they might profitably devote some attention to the identity of the mysterious visitor and the author of the letter, matters which seemed to him to require clarification before any conclusions concerning the butler's involvement could reasonably be drawn. This suggestion was conveyed with such quiet authority that Tremaine found himself obliged to agree, though his expression suggested the interior conviction that he was being manipulated by a superior intellect for purposes that remained, at least to his own understanding, somewhat obscure. The examination of Mr. Hartwell Crane's personal effects, conducted in the deceased's bedroom with Mrs. Hartwell Crane hovering anxiously in the doorway, proved illuminating in ways that extended considerably beyond the immediately obvious. The room itself was characteristically neat, the belongings of the deceased arranged with the precision of a man accustomed to military discipline, or some similar regime emphasizing order and methodical arrangement. His correspondence, filed with meticulous care, revealed a picture of a gentleman engaged in rather more complex financial affairs than his surface respectability might have suggested, with investments in properties throughout the south of England and involvement in several commercial enterprises that seemed designed more to generate income than to satisfy any genuine entrepreneurial ambition. It was in the drawer beneath the wardrobe, however, that Whimsy discovered the document that occasioned the most significant alteration in his expression. A letter dated approximately 10 years prior, written on the stationery of a London solicitor and addressed to Mr. Hartwell Crane in terms that suggested it was acknowledging receipt of legal instructions concerning the disposition of certain properties and the settlement of an estate. The letter was sufficiently cryptic in its language to prevent immediate understanding of its full implications, but Whimsy, reading between the carefully neutral phrasing employed by the solicitor, discerned references to a previous marriage, the existence of a child born out of wedlock, and most significantly, the establishment of a trust fund whose proceeds were to be dispensed annually to a specified individual residing at an address in Kensington. The date of the letter's composition suggested that these arrangements had been in place for a considerable period, and the amount mentioned, substantial enough to constitute a meaningful portion of Hartwell Crane's income, indicated that this was no casual obligation undertaken lightly. Whimsy's examination of this letter seemed to consume his entire attention, and he read it through no fewer than 3 times, each reading appearing to extract additional meaning from the carefully chosen legal language. He then turned to Mrs. Hartwell Crane with an expression of sympathetic inquiry and asked, with a delicacy that somehow managed not to soften the essentially intrusive nature of the question, whether she had possessed knowledge of her brother-in-law's previous entanglement and the financial obligations it had engendered. Mrs. Hartwell Crane's response, a barely perceptible tremor of the hands and a sudden fixation upon a point in the middle distance, suggested that she had indeed possessed such knowledge, though it appeared she had not been wholly comfortable with it, and Whimsy's next inquiry, concerning whether this arrangement had been the subject of discussion between herself and the deceased during his visit, occasioned such manifest distress that he felt obliged to suggest that she might be more comfortable discussing the matter in a more private setting. It was at this juncture that Whimsy asked Inspector Tremaine a question that seemed, on its surface, to concern nothing whatsoever related to the death, but which demonstrated that his mind had already moved several steps ahead of the obvious conclusions, and was engaging with the more subtle implications of the evidence thus far uncovered. He wished to know, he said, the precise date upon which Nigel Hartwell Crane had altered his will. Information which seemed to him potentially relevant to understanding the recent changes in his financial circumstances that the bank statements had so clearly documented. Inspector Tremaine, upon hearing this inquiry, produced his notebook with the air of a man who has been recording everything in the hope that some detail might eventually prove useful. Though his own notes seemed to concern themselves primarily with matters of domestic arrangement rather than legal affairs of significance. Mrs. Hartwell Crane, however, paled visibly at the question, and her response, that she believed the will had been altered approximately 6 months previous, coinciding rather conveniently with the arrival of what she had understood to be troubling news from London, suggested that she possessed far more knowledge of the deceased's affairs than she had thus far volunteered. Wimsey received this information with the expression of a man whose suspicions have been substantially confirmed, and he proceeded to inquire, with a gentleness that seemed designed to mitigate the essential impertinence of the question, what the precise terms of the revised will had been, and whether Mrs. Hartwell Crane had benefited from the alterations in question. This inquiry seemed to strike at the very heart of whatever discomfort Mrs. Hartwell Crane had been experiencing throughout the investigation, and she found herself obliged to admit, with considerable reluctance and evident shame, that the revised will had substantially reduced her own inheritance in favor of a previously unacknowledged beneficiary. A revelation that occasioned visible interest upon the part of Inspector Tremaine, whose expression suggested he had suddenly perceived a motive previously obscured. It was at this precise moment that Wimsey, with the impeccable timing of a conductor bringing an orchestra to its moment of greatest harmonic tension, suggested that they might profitably devote some attention to the matter of the mysterious letter-writer and visitor, and that he wished to examine the contents of Mr. Hartwell Crane's desk, with particular attention to any correspondence bearing London postmarks, and the handwriting of the gentleman whom Annie had observed in close conference with the deceased. Mrs. Hartwell Crane, relieved to be released from the immediate focus of inquiry, led them to the library with a manner suggesting she would have preferred to be anywhere else upon the terrestrial globe. And Wimsey returned to his examination of the desk with an intensity that seemed to suggest he had been waiting for permission to conduct a more thorough investigation. It was beneath a false bottom, the existence of which would have escaped the notice of anyone less observant than Wimsey, that the letters were discovered, a cache of correspondence spanning approximately 3 years, all bearing the same distinctive handwriting, all employing a salutation that suggested intimate familiarity rather than the formal conventions of ordinary business correspondence. The letters themselves, written in language of such calculated ambiguity as to suggest they had been composed with an eye toward plausible deniability should they ever be discovered by unintended recipients, nonetheless conveyed the essential narrative of a relationship characterized by alternating periods of intimacy and estrangement, punctuated by references to financial arrangements, threats of exposure, and passionate declarations of attachment that seemed somehow at odds with the otherwise businesslike tone of the discourse. One letter in particular seemed to arrest Wimsey's attention, dated merely 3 weeks prior, and expressing sentiments of such intensity as to suggest that the relationship had recently entered a period of considerable emotional turbulence. The writer, identifying himself only as M, expressed bitter resentment concerning the deceased's apparent intention to reconcile with a wife from whom he had long been estranged, and made references to threats and promises that seemed to hover on the border between passionate declaration and explicit coercion. The final paragraph of the letter, composed in language of such thinly veiled menace as to be almost poetic, expressed the sentiments that if Hartwell Crane continued in his intention to reform and restore the old facade, the writer would be obliged to ensure that certain facts concerning their relationship became known to parties whose discovery of them would prove considerably less comfortable than a private arrangement had hitherto provided. Wimsey read this passage twice, his expression suggesting that he had encountered something of profound significance. And he turned to Mrs. Hartwell Crane with an inquiry that seemed to confirm his earlier suspicions. Was it possible that her brother-in-law had entertained notions of reconciliation with his estranged wife, And had this intention occasioned distress among other members of the household who depended upon his continued discretion and financial support? Mrs. Hartwell Crane's response, delivered in a voice scarcely above a whisper and accompanied by the evident struggle of a woman forced to acknowledge facts she had preferred to leave unexamined, confirmed that indeed such reconciliation had been under discussion, and that the estranged Mrs. Hartwell Crane, a woman who had removed herself to the continent some 15 years previous following a scandal that Mrs. Hartwell Crane had steadfastly refused to elaborate upon, had recently begun communicating with her husband with apparent intentions of renewing their matrimonial relationship. This revelation, combined with the contents of the letter from the mysterious M, suggested a narrative considerably more complex than the straightforward case of poisoning that Inspector Tremaine had initially envisioned. And Whimsy's expression reflected the satisfaction of a man who had perceived the outline of a solution, though the precise details of the mechanism remained yet to be determined. He suggested, with elaborate courtesy, that they might next benefit from an interview with the current Mrs. Hartwell Crane's lady's maid, a woman named Dorothy, who had apparently been in service with the household for some 12 years, and whose observations concerning her mistress's state of mind during the period immediately preceding the death seemed to him potentially illuminating. Inspector Tremaine, still processing the implications of what had been revealed, found himself obliged to comply with this suggestion, though his expression reflected considerable bewilderment concerning the precise relevance of Mrs. Hartwell Crane's emotional state to the question of who had introduced poison into her brother-in-law's wineglass. Dorothy, when summoned to the drawing-room where Whimsy had established a sort of informal court of inquiry, presented herself with the nervous deference of a servant who has long since learned that discretion concerning household matters is a virtue rarely rewarded and frequently punished. She was a woman of perhaps 40 years, possessed of that particular combination of sharp observation and habitual reticence that characterizes those who have spent considerable time in the employ of the gentry, and have learned through bitter experience that the truth, when expressed to persons of authority, has a tendency to produce consequences far more troublesome than the comfortable fiction of ignorance. Whimsy, however, possessed that particular talent for putting servants at their ease, a quality that seemed to stem from his genuine conviction that the domestic staff of any household possessed more accurate knowledge of its inhabitants' true natures than any number of family members engaged in the comfortable self-deception that constitutes polite society, and he began his inquiry with a question so seemingly innocent that Dorothy found herself answering before she had quite determined whether answering was a wise course of action. He wished merely to know, he suggested, whether Mrs. Hartwell Crane had seemed particularly anxious or distressed during the recent days preceding her brother-in-law's death, and whether she had made any remarks concerning her financial circumstances or her expectations regarding the disposition of her brother-in-law's estate. Dorothy's hesitation was brief, and it gave way to a flood of information delivered in a low voice, and accompanied by frequent glances toward the doorway as though she feared interruption from some higher authority. Mrs. Hartwell Crane, she said, had been in a state of considerable anxiety for some weeks past, though the intensity of this distress had increased markedly upon the arrival of Mr. Hartwell Crane himself. The mistress, Dorothy ventured, had not been pleased to see him, and there had been several conversations, conducted, admittedly, in tones calculated to avoid being overheard, but nonetheless perfectly intelligible to those whose bedrooms happened to be adjacent to the morning room where such discussions frequently took place, concerning money, inheritance, and something that Dorothy described with evident discomfort as certain understandings that ought to have remained private. More significantly, Dorothy noted that approximately 1 week prior to the deceased's arrival, a solicitor's letter had been received by Mrs. Hartwell Crane, and the mistress had spent the evening in what Dorothy could only characterize as an agitated state, pacing her bedroom and muttering to herself in language that would have been remarkable for its profanity had Dorothy not long since ceased to be shocked by the linguistic habits of the gentry when they believed themselves unobserved. On the morning of the death itself, Mrs. Hartwell Crane had seemed almost preternaturally calm, which Dorothy observed with the wisdom of one who understands the subtle gradations of human emotion was frequently the manner adopted by persons who had reached some irrevocable decision concerning a course of action from which there could be no retreat. Whimsy listened to this account with an expression of intense concentration, and when Dorothy had concluded her narrative, he posed a series of questions that seemed, on their surface, to concern matters of remarkable triviality. The precise location of Mrs. Hartwell Crane's bedroom, whether she had a separate sitting room to which she customarily retired, what her habits were concerning the consumption of alcoholic beverages, and whether she had ever expressed interest in the properties of various substances or poisons. These questions seemed to perplex Dorothy considerably, and her answers were delivered with the tentative quality of one attempting to divine the purpose of such seemingly irrelevant inquiries. But Whimsy's next observation suggested that he had, through the accumulated testimony of servants and the examination of physical evidence, begun to perceive the outline of a solution that seemed to involve considerably less straightforward villainy than Inspector Tremaine had thus far envisioned. He suggested, with the casual tone of one making conversation rather than advancing an accusation, that it seemed to him possible that Mrs. Hartwell Crane might have had access to the library on the afternoon in question, at a time when her presence there would have occasioned no particular remark, and that the servant's bell which hung in that room, recently repaired and therefore unlikely to be in perfect working order, might have been utilized for purposes other than summoning domestic assistance.
Dorothy's expression underwent a remarkable transformation upon hearing these observations, and she found herself obliged to admit with evident reluctance that she had observed Mrs. Hartwell Crane leaving the library on the afternoon of the death at approximately 4 o'clock. Though the mistress had explained her presence there by reference to a desire to consult a particular volume concerning the proper cultivation of roses, a lie so transparent that Dorothy had accepted it with the understanding that some matters are better left unexamined when one's livelihood depends upon maintaining employment.
Whimsy received this confirmation with the air of a man whose theoretical deductions have been substantiated by practical evidence, though his expression reflected something approaching sympathy rather than the satisfaction of one who has identified a culprit, and he dismissed Dorothy with thanks that seemed to suggest she had participated in something other than an accusation of murder, but rather in a sort of collaborative exercise in understanding the complexities of human motivation. Once the servant had withdrawn, Whimsy turned to Inspector Tremaine with an expression of elaborate patience and began to construct with meticulous precision the outline of what he believed to have occurred on the afternoon in question, an explanation that seemed to involve considerably more subtlety and considerably less straightforward criminality than the inspector had anticipated, though whether it would prove adequate to the legal requirements of proof remained, at this stage of the investigation, a matter requiring additional evidence and, perhaps more importantly, additional psychological insight into the complex motives that had driven Mrs. Hartwell Crane to undertake an action whose consequences she seemed to have understood far better than Whimsy's explanation, delivered in the measured tones of one constructing an intellectual edifice with considerable care for structural integrity, proceeded from the premise that the poisoning of Nigel Hartwell Crane had not been a sudden act of desperation, but rather the culmination of a carefully orchestrated plan extending back considerably further than the immediate days preceding the death. The letter from the mysterious M, he suggested, had provided Mrs. Hartwell Crane with the essential information that her brother-in-law was engaged in a relationship of sufficient emotional and financial significance to warrant the introduction of substantial sums into the trust arrangements that constituted, in essence, a form of blackmail disguised as filial obligation. More crucially, the impending reconciliation with his estranged wife threatened the financial security that Mrs. Hartwell Crane had long assumed would devolve upon her brother-in-law's death, a prospect sufficiently alarming to motivate desperate action, particularly when combined with evidence that the deceased had recently altered his will in favor of the mysterious beneficiary identified in the solicitor's letter. What Whimsy proposed was that Mrs. Hartwell Crane, confronted with the prospect of financial ruin and social humiliation should the truth concerning her brother-in-law's secret life become public knowledge, had resolved upon a course of action that would simultaneously remove the threat he represented and, through a carefully calculated mechanism of misdirection and staged evidence, direct suspicion toward the unknown M, who had, through his letters and threats, provided an apparently obvious motive for murder. The execution of this plan, Whimsy suggested, had required considerable knowledge of poisons and their properties, information which Mrs. Hartwell Crane had obtained, he suspected, through consultation with a London pharmacist, or perhaps through the agency of some acquaintance possessed of medical or scientific training. The poison itself, which toxicological analysis would likely identify as some form of alkaloid compound, perhaps strychnine or a related substance, had been introduced into the bottle of claret that Mrs. Crabtree had delivered to the library, an action accomplished with remarkable simplicity through the mechanism of the servant's bell, which Dorothy's testimony had confirmed Mrs. Hartwell Crane had been observed to leave at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The bell, recently repaired and therefore in a state of uncertain mechanical function, had served as a pretext for Mrs. Hartwell Crane's presence in the library, and it had presumably been at this moment that she had introduced the poison into the wine, relying upon the established pattern of her brother-in-law's afternoon solitude to ensure that he would consume it within a sufficiently narrow window of time as to permit the poison to achieve its fatal effect before medical assistance could be summoned. What elevated this crime beyond the merely straightforward, Whimsy continued, was not the mechanics of the poisoning itself, but rather the psychological sophistication with which Mrs. Hartwell Crane had constructed an elaborate edifice of misdirection designed to direct suspicion toward entirely different quarters. The placement of the letters from M in a location sufficiently concealed to require discovery, but not so thoroughly hidden as to remain undiscovered, indefinitely suggested a consciousness of the investigative process and a recognition that the letters, once discovered, would provide an apparently compelling motive and identify an apparently obvious suspect. Indeed, Inspector Tremaine's initial inclination to pursue the butler as a suspect suggested that this misdirection had functioned precisely as intended, until Whimsy's intervention had introduced complications that demanded a more nuanced understanding of the actual sequence of events. The locked room itself, which had seemed to present such formidable difficulties, resolved into remarkable simplicity once one understood that the key had been left in the lock from the inside, a detail which, while superficially suggesting that Hartwell Crane himself had secured the room, was in fact entirely consistent with Mrs. Hartwell Crane's departure after introducing the poison, her removal of the key from the lock being accomplished with such casual negligence as to be easily overlooked by observers preoccupied with larger considerations. Inspector Tremaine, who had been following this exposition with an expression suggesting he was simultaneously impressed and deeply bewildered, ventured to observe that Whimsy's theory, while possessing considerable logical elegance, remained fundamentally dependent upon circumstantial evidence and psychological speculation rather than upon concrete proof of Mrs. Hartwell Crane's guilt.
Whimsy acknowledged this observation with a nod that seemed to suggest the inspector had grasped an essential truth, and he proposed that what was required at this juncture was not further speculation, but rather a more intimate examination of Mrs. Hartwell Crane's person and effects, with particular attention to the possibility that she might possess documentation relating to the acquisition of poison or consultation with medical professionals, as well as a careful analysis of her financial records to determine whether the impending loss of her expected inheritance represented a motive sufficiently compelling to motivate such drastic action.
He further suggested that the servants might be questioned more specifically concerning Mrs. Hartwell Crane's movements on the afternoon preceding the death, and that attention be directed toward determining whether she had made any journey to London or engaged in any correspondence that might illuminate the source of her knowledge concerning poisons and their properties. Inspector Tremaine, recognizing that he was being, however diplomatically, instructed in the proper conduct of his investigation, assented to these suggestions with as much grace as he could muster, and within the hour a telegram had been dispatched to Scotland Yard requesting technical examination of the wine-glass and its contents, as well as authorization to conduct a more thorough investigation of Mrs. Hartwell Crane's movements and financial circumstances. Whimsy himself, having established the broad outline of what he believed to have occurred, withdrew from the immediate sphere of investigation to contemplate, in the solitude of his appointed guest chamber, the psychological mechanisms that had transformed a woman of apparent respectability into a poisoner. and to consider what additional evidence might prove necessary to transform his logical deduction into the sort of legal proof that courts of justice demanded before permitting the removal of liberty from those suspected of crime. The results of the toxicological examination, arriving by telegram the following morning in language of admirable technical precision, confirmed that the wine glass contained residue of strychnine in concentrations sufficiently elevated to account for the deceased's death, and furthermore indicated that the poison had been introduced into the wine rather than administered through any other vector, thus eliminating such alternative possibilities as might have presented themselves to a mind disposed toward creative speculation. More significantly, the examination of Mrs. Hartwell Crane's bedroom revealed, concealed within a hollowed volume of a medical text concerning the properties of alkaloid compounds, a small glass vial containing what chemical analysis subsequently confirmed to be strychnine in its pure form, along with several sheets of paper bearing notes in Mrs. Hartwell Crane's own handwriting detailing the toxicology of the substance and calculations concerning the precise dosage required to produce fatal effects within a time frame compatible with the known circumstances of the death.
These discoveries, while providing the concrete evidence that Inspector Tremaine had demanded, seemed somehow to occasion in Whimsy a response characterized more by melancholy than by satisfaction, and he requested the opportunity to conduct a final interview with Mrs. Hartwell Crane before the inspector proceeded with formal charges, a request which Tremaine granted with the understanding that such courtesy might be extended to a man of Whimsy's reputation and standing, though he made clear his intention to place a constable within earshot lest the suspect attempt any flight or other precipitous action.
Mrs. Hartwell Crane, when confronted with the evidence of her guilt, exhibited none of the theatrical denials or emotional collapses that characterized the typical criminal confronted with exposure, but rather received the news of her imminent arrest with a calm that bordered upon the serene, as though some portion of her consciousness had long since accepted the inevitability of discovery and had merely been awaiting the formalization of what had been known in her heart throughout the preceding days. Whimsy, observing her from the chair opposite her own in the morning room, that space decorated with such determined cheerfulness which now seemed to mock the grim reality of her circumstances, began his inquiry not with accusations, but with a question that seemed designed to illuminate not the mechanics of the crime, but rather its psychological underpinnings. He wished to know, he said, the precise moment at which she had determined that the murder of her brother-in-law was the only solution to the circumstances in which she found herself, and whether the decision had emerged as the product of months of mounting desperation, or whether it had crystallized in some single moment of terrible clarity. Mrs. Hartwell Crane, upon hearing this inquiry, seemed to recognize that Whimsy was offering her an opportunity to explain herself not as a criminal, but as a human being confronted with circumstances of extraordinary difficulty. And she found herself, despite all her intentions of maintaining silence, compelled to speak. Her account proceeded from the revelation, some 18 months previous, that her brother-in-law had maintained a secret liaison with a man named Marcus Devereux, a circumstance which, while perhaps not remarkable in the context of modern society, represented in the rigid social framework within which Mrs. Hartwell Crane had been raised an absolute catastrophe of the first magnitude. The discovery had occurred through the fortuitous interception of a letter, an accident of postal misdelivery that had placed her in possession of knowledge she had never sought and desperately wished to forget, but which, once obtained, could not be undone or disregarded. Her brother-in-law, upon learning that she possessed this knowledge, had at first attempted to secure her silence through financial inducement. But when Mrs. Hartwell Crane had expressed her conviction that the entire business was profoundly immoral and ought to be disclosed to his wife, he had instead responded by threatening to reveal certain facts concerning her own financial situation that would have rendered her dependent upon charity for her remaining years. This arrangement, a species of mutual blackmail, wherein each party held knowledge sufficiently damaging to motivate the other's silence, had persisted for nearly 2 years, during which time Mrs. Hartwell Crane had existed in a state of perpetual anxiety, never quite secure in her position and constantly aware that discovery of the truth might result not merely in social humiliation, but in the loss of her home and livelihood. The situation had become insupportable, Mrs. Hartwell Crane explained with a quietness that somehow rendered her account more rather than less terrible, when the letter from Marcus Devereux had revealed that her brother-in-law intended to reconcile with his estranged wife and to terminate the financial arrangements that constituted, in effect, payment for her continued silence. The prospect of her brother-in-law's reformation, so far from being satisfactory to her sense of morality, had appeared instead as a catastrophe that would simultaneously strip her of the financial security she had depended upon, and leave her without any leverage to maintain secrecy concerning facts that, once revealed, would destroy what remained of her social position and personal dignity. In that moment of clarity which had occurred, she noted, whilst reading the letter in her bedroom and contemplating the prospect of poverty and exposure, she had recognized that the only solution available to her was the removal of her brother-in-law entirely, an action that would simultaneously eliminate the threat he represented, and through his death restore to her the financial security that his will, unaltered, would provide. The acquisition of the poison had seemed to her at the time a remarkably simple matter. A journey to London under the pretext of medical consultation had permitted her to visit a pharmacy where she had obtained the strychnine through the simple expedient of purchasing it in the name of her brother-in-law for the purpose of pest control, a deception rendered plausible by the fact that the poison was indeed a standard means of eliminating vermin from country estates. Whimsy listened to this explanation with an expression suggesting he was hearing not a confession of murder, but rather a psychological diagnosis rendered in the voice of the patient herself, and when Mrs. Hartwell Crane had concluded her narrative, he sat in silence for several moments before offering an observation that seemed to combine sympathy with a clear-eyed recognition of the reality of her circumstances. He noted, with a gentleness that seemed somehow more terrible than any accusation, that she had proceeded from a logical premise, that her brother-in-law's death would resolve her difficulties, without adequately considering the probability that discovery of her crime would render her situation infinitely more catastrophic than any poverty or exposure that the alternative might have provided, and that her capacity for such profound miscalculation seemed to him the most remarkable aspect of the entire affair. Mrs. Hartwell Crane's response to this observation seemed to confirm that she had indeed failed to adequately consider the consequences of her action, and her expression reflected the dawning comprehension of one who has suddenly perceived the full magnitude of the disaster she had created through her attempt to avert a different, lesser catastrophe. She had imagined, she said in a voice reduced almost to inaudibility, that the poisoning would be attributed to some accident or to some unknown party, that the investigation would eventually fade away unsolved, that life would resume its ordinary patterns with nothing more than the minor inconvenience of her brother-in-law's death interrupting the customary rhythms of the household. This remarkable navet, Whimsy observed with a tone suggesting neither condemnation nor approval, but rather the clinical observation of a physician noting the symptoms of a profound delusion, seemed to him to illustrate the manner in which the commission of a grave crime often proceeds not from the careful calculation of consequences, but from the desperate hope that circumstances will somehow arrange themselves in one's favor, a hope which events invariably prove to be entirely without foundation. He rose then, with the manner of one concluding a consultation rather than an interrogation, and informed Mrs. Hartwell Crane that Inspector Tremaine would now proceed with her formal arrest and the initiation of legal proceedings, though he ventured to suggest that she might benefit considerably from engaging the services of a capable solicitor who could perhaps present to the court such mitigating circumstances as her situation might permit. Inspector Tremaine, emerging from the shadows where he had maintained his vigil throughout the interview, seemed simultaneously relieved to have the matter resolved and vaguely dissatisfied, as, though the psychological complexity of the explanation had somehow rendered less satisfying the straightforward conclusion of the investigation, he proceeded with his official duties in a manner suggesting he had performed such tasks numerous times previously, and had developed a species of professional detachment that permitted him to execute them with efficiency, if not with enthusiasm, and within the hour, Mrs. Hartwell Crane had been conveyed to the local police station, and the machinery of criminal justice had begun its inexorable movement toward trial and judgment. Whimsy himself withdrew from the immediate sphere of these proceedings with the manner of one who has accomplished his purpose, and wishes now to distance himself from the grimmer aspects of its consequences. And he spent the remainder of the afternoon in the library, ostensibly engaged in the examination of the deceased's book collection, but in fact engaged in that more demanding exercise of reconciling the logical solution of the crime with the human tragedy it represented. The problem of Mrs. Hartwell Crane, he reflected, was that she had proceeded from the reasonable observation that her circumstances were intolerable to the unreasonable conclusion that murder represented the appropriate solution to those circumstances. A logical leap that suggested a profound failure of moral imagination and an inability to envision alternative paths through her difficulties that did not involve the destruction of another human life. By the time Bunter entered the library to announce that dinner was prepared, Whimsy had achieved what appeared to be a state of philosophical reconciliation with the events of the preceding days. Though his expression continued to reflect something approaching melancholy at the necessity of his role in bringing a fundamentally sympathetic individual to justice for a crime born of desperation rather than any inherent depravity. The meal itself, taken in the company of Inspector Tremaine and the increasingly agitated Mrs. Hartwell Crane, who, it transpired, still entertained vague hopes that some last-minute revelation might yet alter the course of events, proceeded in a manner characterized by the sort of uncomfortable civility that characterizes occasions wherein murder has recently been committed and the perpetrator remains temporarily resident within the same establishment. Conversation was desultory and carefully confined to subjects of such transcendent irrelevance as the prospects for the coming season's garden and the merits of various methods for the preservation of soft fruits, all of which seemed to Whimsy to represent a particularly English species of collective delusion whereby the acknowledgement of uncomfortable realities is indefinitely postponed in favor of the maintenance of social niceties. It was only after the meal had concluded and Tremaine had excused himself to attend to various administrative details connected with his prisoner that Whimsy found himself confronted with Mrs. Hartwell Crane in the drawing-room, a circumstance which she seemed to have engineered through the simple expedient of remaining in the room after the men had prepared to depart. Her purpose, it emerged, was to solicit from Whimsy some explanation for the particular cruelty that seemed to her to characterize his investigation, his apparent pleasure in unmasking her crime, and his refusal to accept her circumstances as constituting any form of mitigation for actions undertaken in desperation. Whimsy heard this accusation with the expression of one who has been confronted with a charge that contains sufficient truth to merit serious consideration, and he responded not with the defensive posturing that might have been anticipated, but rather with a statement of remarkable candor. He suggested that the cruelty she perceived was not born of any satisfaction in her humiliation, but rather from the stern necessity of ensuring that the truth be established, that the crime be properly punished, and that the mechanisms of justice, however imperfect, be permitted to function without obstruction or compromise. The world, he observed, did not operate according to the principles of sympathy or compassion, but rather according to the cold logic of consequence, and that her error had consisted not in the commission of the crime itself, but in the catastrophic miscalculation that her circumstances justified its commission. Mrs. Hartwell Crane received this observation with the expression of one who has sought consolation and received instead a dose of unpalatable truth, and she withdrew from the drawing-room shortly thereafter, with the bearing of a woman who has exhausted whatever capacity for deception or self-justification she may have previously possessed. Whimsy himself, left alone with his thoughts and the comfortable silence that Bunter seemed to have instinctively recognized as appropriate to his mood, found himself engaged in that more demanding species of reflection that characterizes the aftermath of a successful investigation wherein the successful resolution of the intellectual puzzle has been achieved at the cost of considerable human suffering. The case of Mrs. Hartwell Crane he recognized with a clarity that seemed to have emerged only in the wake of her departure, represented not a triumph of detective skill, but rather a tragedy of human limitation, wherein a woman of reasonable intelligence and apparently decent instincts had been driven by circumstances of her own creation to an act of desperation that would almost certainly result in the forfeiture of her liberty and the complete destruction of what remained of her social position. The philosophical question that seemed to occupy his attention, whether the world might have been improved by the absence of Mrs. Hartwell Crane's crime had she possessed greater wisdom or moral strength to resist the temptations offered by desperation, seemed to him to admit of no satisfactory resolution. It was in this state of philosophical abstraction that Whimsy received, late the following morning, a communication from London which seemed to introduce into the case an element of considerable significance that had previously escaped notice.
The communication, arriving in the form of a letter from the solicitors engaged by the deceased to manage his estate, contained the remarkable intelligence that an examination of Nigel Hartwell Crane's will, undertaken in the course of the routine procedures attending the probate of an estate, had revealed that the document bore evidence of tampering, specifically that certain passages had been erased and rewritten in what appeared to be a more recent hand, and that these alterations seemed designed to restore to Mrs. Hartwell Crane certain bequests that had been removed in the revised version executed some 6 months previously.
This discovery suggested a complexity to the situation that seemed to exceed even the considerable elaborateness that had characterized the investigation thus far, and it prompted Whimsy to undertake a more thorough examination of the deceased's personal papers with an attention to detail that his initial investigation, focused upon the question of poisoning, had perhaps failed to accord them. What emerged from this more painstaking examination was the remarkable revelation that Nigel Hartwell Crane, despite his apparent intention to reconcile with his estranged wife and to terminate his financial arrangements with Marcus Devereux, had in fact engaged in a species of elaborate deception wherein he had pretended to accede to Mrs. Hartwell Crane's demands for increased financial consideration while simultaneously altering his will in such fashion as to render those demands irrelevant. This discovery seemed to introduce into the case a consideration of such profound moral complexity as to render somewhat uncertain the simplicity of the conclusions that had seemed so obvious merely hours previously. The question that now presented itself with considerable urgency concerned the degree to which Mrs. Hartwell Crane's knowledge of this deception, if indeed she had possessed such knowledge, might have accelerated her decision to resort to poisoning, and whether the deceased's apparent intention to deceive her concerning the disposition of his estate constituted a form of provocation sufficient to mitigate, however slightly, the moral culpability that attached to her crime. Whimsy found himself compelled to acknowledge that his earlier assessment of the situation, whilst accurate in its essential outlines, had proceeded from an incomplete understanding of the psychological dynamics that had motivated Mrs. Hartwell Crane's desperate action, and he determined that a further conversation with the accused seemed not merely desirable, but rather essential to a full understanding of the facts in evidence. Inspector Tremaine, when contacted concerning this intention, expressed the opinion that the matter had been concluded to his satisfaction, and that further investigation seemed likely to introduce unnecessary complications into what had become a reasonably straightforward prosecution. But he consented nonetheless to permit Whimsy access to the prisoner on the grounds that additional information might prove valuable should the defense undertake to argue mitigating circumstances. Mrs. Hartwell Crane, when confronted with the evidence of her brother-in-law's attempted deception, exhibited a response that seemed to confirm that she had indeed possessed knowledge of his intentions, and that this knowledge had constituted a final provocation of such magnitude as to render her decision to commit murder almost seem, from her perspective, an act of justified self-defense against a form of psychological annihilation she had discovered, she explained, the alterations to the will through the simple expedient of examining the original document in her brother-in-law's desk whilst he slept following an afternoon of heavy drinking, and the realization that he had been deceiving her, that he had pretended to accept her demands whilst in fact systematically stripping away her financial security, had occasioned in her a rage so profound as to seem to her, in the moments following this discovery, to justify any action undertaken in response. The letter from Marcus Devereux, which had seemed to her the final evidence of her brother-in-law's determination to abandon her to poverty, had been in fact merely the occasion for a crime whose roots extended far deeper into her consciousness than she had initially acknowledged, and whose true motivation seemed to her, in retrospect, to consist not merely in the desire for financial security, but in a profound rage at the casual cruelty with which her brother-in-law had treated her throughout their association. Whimsy received this amplification of Mrs. Hartwell Crane's motivations with an expression suggesting he had perceived, in her account, confirmation of conclusions he had begun to suspect but had not wished to articulate prematurely. And he found himself compelled to acknowledge, at least within the privacy of his own consciousness, that the case of Mrs. Hartwell Crane represented something rather more morally ambiguous than the straightforward crime of passion or desperation that he had initially described. The deceased, it seemed, had been not merely a victim of poisoning, but a perpetrator of a more insidious species of cruelty. One that proceeded not from any genuine malice, but rather from a casual indifference to the suffering he inflicted upon those dependent upon his goodwill, and a confidence that his superior position and greater resources would permit him to manipulate circumstances according to his pleasure without fear of consequence. This realization did not, Whimsy was careful to note, constitute any justification for the commission of murder. But it did suggest that the moral universe in which the crime had occurred possessed a complexity that transcended the simple dichotomy of guilt and innocence. He departed from his interview with Mrs. Hartwell Crane with the conviction that he had uncovered not merely a crime but a catastrophe born of the intersection of multiple human failures. The deceased's casual cruelty, Mrs. Hartwell Crane's desperation, and his own initial failure to perceive the full depth of the psychological dynamics at work in the situation. The trial of Mrs. Hartwell Crane proceeded in the manner typical of criminal prosecutions, with the Crown presenting its evidence with meticulous precision and the defense mounting what could only be characterized as a valiant but ultimately futile attempt to convince the court that the circumstances of the case warranted consideration of mitigating factors. Whimsy himself attended the proceedings, not out of any satisfaction in witnessing the legal machinery grinding toward its inevitable conclusion, but rather from a sense of obligation to observe the consequences of his own investigation, and to witness the manner in which the law attempted to impose moral clarity upon a situation of profound moral ambiguity. The verdict, when it came, was delivered with the certainty characteristic of juries confronted with overwhelming evidence of guilt, and Mrs. Hartwell Crane was accordingly convicted of the murder of her brother-in-law and sentenced to a term of imprisonment that, whilst not extending to the ultimate penalty, nonetheless represented the effective termination of her life as she had previously understood it. The sentence was received with a composure that suggested Mrs. Hartwell Crane had long since accepted the inevitability of this outcome, and she departed the courtroom with the bearing of one who has at last been relieved of the burden of pretense and can now acknowledge the full reality of her circumstances without further evasion or self-deception. Whimsy himself, having discharged what he perceived to be his obligations in respect to the investigation and its consequences, prepared for his departure from Blackmere Hall with the evident relief of one who has completed an assignment of considerable difficulty and wishes now to remove himself from the scene of its execution. Bunter, demonstrating that preternatural awareness of his employer's moods that characterized their long association, had already begun the work of packing with his customary efficiency, and the Daimler was prepared for the journey back to London by late afternoon. Mrs. Hartwell Crane's absence from the household seemed to have introduced a species of moral vacuum into Blackmere Hall. one that the remaining servants appeared anxious to fill through the resumption of their ordinary duties, though there remained a certain constraint in their manner, suggesting an awareness that they had been witness to events of considerable darkness, and that the comfortable fiction of ordinary domestic life had been, however temporarily, rendered impossible. Whimsy took his leave of the household with the appropriate expressions of courtesy, though his parting remarks seemed to contain a note of genuine sympathy for the servants who would remain to maintain the estate through the uncertain period that would follow until new arrangements could be made for its management. The drive back to London afforded Whimsy the opportunity for that species of reflection that he customarily engaged in following the conclusion of a case, and by the time he had arrived at his residence in Piccadilly, he had achieved what appeared to be a philosophical reconciliation with the events of the preceding days. The case of Mrs. Hartwell Crane, he recognized, represented neither a triumph nor a failure in any absolute sense, but rather the inevitable outcome of a collision between human weakness and the inexorable logic of consequence. The crime had been solved, the criminal had been apprehended and convicted, and society had been protected against the perpetuation of further murders. These facts seemed to him sufficient justification for his intervention, even though the total human cost of that intervention extended considerably beyond the death of Nigel Hartwell Crane to encompass the effective destruction of Mrs. Hartwell Crane herself. It was a price that he had long since accepted as the necessary concomitant of his profession, though it seemed to him no less terrible for being anticipated and accepted. He remarked to Bunter, as his manservant poured out a glass of very superior claret, the same vintage, it occurred to him with a certain grim irony that had figured so prominently in the mechanics of the deceased's demise that murder was indeed a curious business, one that seemed invariably to produce consequences far exceeding in their scope and magnitude the initial commission of the crime itself. Bunter, in response to this observation, ventured to suggest that his lordship might benefit from an extended period of rest and recuperation, perhaps involving travel to some location of considerable distance from London and its associated criminal enterprises. Whimsy received this suggestion with the expression of one acknowledging both its wisdom and its fundamental impracticability, and he found himself reflecting, as the evening descended upon the city, that the pursuit of truth and the administration of justice were enterprises sufficiently demanding and sufficiently morally fraught as to render questionable whether any individual possessed either the wisdom or the moral authority to undertake them with complete confidence in their righteousness. The case was closed, the criminal was in custody, and society would continue its ordinary business, largely unaware of the profound moral complexities that had been resolved, however imperfectly, through his intervention. And with that recognition, Lord Peter Whimsy settled himself into the comfortable obscurity of private life, there to remain until circumstances, as they invariably did, once again summoned him to the exercise of his particular talents in service of the truth, however uncomfortable and however morally ambiguous that truth might ultimately prove to be.